We've been talking a lot in the past few weeks on like how good the design of our bodies are, life is, how complicated it is, but it all functions. However, there are arguments saying that the reality is there is poorly designed aspects in nature and in our bodies. And what does that mean for intelligent design hypothesis? If things are intelligently designed, especially from an all-powerful, all-knowing God, then why would there be aspects in nature that don't seem to be designed well?
First, you have to prove the claim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you just tell me that they're poorly designed and then ask me why.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you made the claim that they're poorly designed. Now you prove it.
Yeah. Kind of seems like a subjective statement.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
How do we even know, like, what's our basis for comparison?
Right.
Yeah. No, those are good. Those are good initial thoughts and good initial skepticism of the claims.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can start by like just talking about some examples that get called out. So there are a number of them. Maybe we'll start with the eye. Like we talked about the eye last month quite a bit on how complicated it was, how it has all these different cell types, and how it worked in an irreducibly complex way. However, there's an argument to say that it's actually wired oddly. So
It should be able to see through walls.
Yeah. X-ray vision. Come on.
yeah, that's
Poor design.
That's an oversight for sure.
Should like shoot out fire and laser beams.
I mean, come on, where are the lasers?
Duh.
Yeah.
Lizards
Superman
squirt
has
out
them.
blood. Like, why is ours just for visual purposes? It's dumb.
Yeah. So how the poor design argument goes is in your eye you have photosensitive cells, and they are facing outwards so you can see, and then they grab light. You would think that the wire that goes from the photosensitive cells all the way to your brain would be on the back side, right? So like you got the cell poking out, so bringing in light here, and the wire comes into the back.
That's how you think it
That's
should.
how you think it should go. But when we look at it, the wiring actually goes around and in the front where the photosensitive area is. So the argument is like, well, that's not ideal, right? Like that nerve is blocking some of the light from reaching the cell.
Doesn't seem efficient.
Yeah, it doesn't seem efficient. It seems weird to wire it in that way.
The only problem I'm hearing so far is not with the design, but you keep saying words like seams.
Yeah.
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 No, you're right on. I think that is a key aspect because there's a standard of design, right? Like we think like when we engineer something, like that's how I would do it, but like that's not how it is. So we're like, hey, that was poorly designed. So like when you buy a new phone, you're like, why did they design it this way? It's garbage. Why is the button over here? I keep pressing it when I'm taking it out of my pocket or whatever the case may be. You're like, you criticize the design because
It's not how you would do it.
it's not how you would want it.
Right.
For whatever reason, how you're using it or whatever. But I mean, your phone was still designed by an intelligent agent, and they might have had some purposes beyond what you knew, or maybe you're using it outside the use case that they were thinking of. So all of those things come into play as counter arguments. But it's still out there. So the eye is one. There's also there's some nerves in your like it goes from your brain to your larynx, which is like your throat area. And there's two nerves. There's like a major one that goes directly to your throat, and then there's another one that goes down and around a major artery and then back up to your throat. And you're like, well, what? That seems weird. Like, why wouldn't it just be a direct? Like, why does it take this weird route And I didn't double check this statement, but I was doing some various looking. I think this is a common thing in mammals in general, not just humans. So like this, I believe this also occurs in like giraffes who have really long necks. So like it like goes all the way down and then back up quite a ways, which seems even more roundabout. Outside of the human body, pandas have a really seemingly useless thumb. It's actually not even a thumb. It's one of their hand bones that's like comes out, and it kind of is like a thumb, but it's not. There is a picture. You can see it kind of in that bottom right. It's just a hand bone that kind of comes out, and it makes it so that we as humans think, hey, that's
Like
why would that make sense? Like you can't grab anything, and that's a question of.
So that's a sixth.
It's a
Digit.
6 digit,
Like
yeah.
the dew claw and the
Oh,
yeah,
Kind of, yeah.
the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
They just get hurt from it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's also a lot of criticism on so human beings. We walk upright. That's unusual. We're the only mammals to really do that full time, right? And as a result of that, there's a lot of claims that our backs are just not suitable for that. And that's one. It's like, well, yeah, I sneeze and I throw my back out sometimes. And it's like we have personal experience with that, and it's like, well, why is that the way it is? And like, there's a lot of explanations on like what causes that. Like our spine, when we walk, we kind of have like a twisty motion to kind of keep our balance and to like throw our weight in the right way. But that puts a lot of twist motion on the spine. And you think about other animals that are on 4 legs, they don't have that twist motion, right? It's just like they just kind of have this as they run. They kind of goes in and convex and concave, but ours twists this way, which means we have like these. We have the discs between the vertebrae, and they're kind of like, I heard them described as jelly donuts. And I'm like, well, it has Nate grabs a donut. And they kind of have like a soft, squishy interior, and then they kind of have more of like a rubbery sort of exterior that kind of helps with the flexibility of our spine.
Till it slips,
But
or the goo degrades.
the jelly actually pops up, and that's what a herniated disc is. Yeah,
So bad.
is when your jelly comes out, which is I don't know.
Your
It's just
back jelly just
lost my
ruptured.
jelly.
yeah. It's a pretty.
Gross.
I don't know. It's a funny way to think about it, but
So some of the arguments sound like vanity, and some of them sound like sin.
Like what?
You know, some of the arguments sound like vanity. Like I think it should be like legs. And then the other parts, like herniated discs and stuff like that, that sounds like sin.
Like the manifestation of the original sin that
Right. It's like, well, guess what's going to happen
Degradation.
now?
yeah, degradation,
You're gonna lose
entropy.
jelly.
Yeah, you're gonna lose jelly. Yeah, yeah. Because and like our spines are very curved, and that is helpful for us to maintain our balance. I heard one person describe it as like balancing a bunch of teacups and putting like a watermelon on top, and it's like it's like a feeble structure. It's kind of what they were getting at. Yet,
But if you take it as the sum of its parts, I mean, yeah, if you look at just this element,
right?
it's like, well, I can't go within balance a bunch of teacups in a watermelon, so therefore this is a bad design.
Yeah. Yeah, here's another case that maybe even falls in a different category, because I agree with your categorizations. I think those are 2 good counter arguments. There's salamanders, and then there's cave salamanders. Cave salamanders have eye structures that are completely functionless.
Mm-hmm.
So they have eyes that just don't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you,
What's the point?
what's the point? Like, why would a designer give a salamander who's in a cave that can't see anything useless eye structures?
Right.
Like, that's an interesting argument, and I think it's important to think through these things and to like dwell on them and like take criticisms and I don't know, like
Don't just dismiss them.
right.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, let me think through that
Mhm.
and let me see, like I know I have a bias towards intelligent design. See, we're all Christians here, and we believe there was a God who made us and designed us. And with that theology comes another layer of like sin and corruption into God's creation through sin. And like all of that kind of paints the way we look at these arguments. And like, we're like, okay, that could be like a degradation. Like our spines are meant to do that. Maybe that's part of the toil of working, as Chelsea and I were talking about. Like God says after we fail.
Couldn't useless eyeballs be possibly part of a microevolution
Could be.
Mhm.
or something that where, you have the species, but some of them go over here into the dark and some of them go over here to the light. And well, the ones that are over and living in caves probably just
Stop using them.
stop using them, and
Yeah.
then other senses become a little bit more prevalent.
Yeah, that's you nailed it on the head with that one. That's exactly the counter argument that they make in this book. Is it's evidence of microevolution. Like there are changes that we see to adapt to certain environments, and like that's potentially one of them. And while they're in that cave, they had some corruption of their DNA. And now, like, their eyeballs don't work, but that doesn't really matter to them because they weren't using them anyways. Like, where if it was a salamander that wasn't in a cave, that would be detrimental to its ability to survive. But since it didn't matter, it just kept, it just preserved that dysfunction. It's really a de-evolution aspect in a way, because you can't. Like those eyes aren't going to just start working. Like now that they're broken and they've passed that gene on, like to fix them would be
A wild mutation in the opposite direction.
It's very unlikely. And there's actually a book on, I think it's called Darwin De-Evolves, and it's actually super interesting. And it talks about how basically a lot of the evolution that we see in practice, like bears and salamanders and the finches, it's actually a degradation of the information in the DNA. Not necessarily an adding of the information. It's almost like the original, during God's creation, the original kinds had this capacity for a certain range of ability, and like it just gets narrowed down. Like
It's like it gets watered down with every change or generation or breeding of the animal. Things get watered down, which looks like a new thing, but it's just a less of the original. Like when you take a copy to a copy machine, you copy and copy and copy, eventually you start losing details.
But sometimes those degradations are helpful. Like I think I've mentioned this in past meetings, but like polar bears have a few proteins that have been changed that lets them adapt to the cold environment better. Like they can digest highly fatty foods because of a protein change from a normal bear to a polar bear. And same with like their fur and like there's just a number of changes that seem to go from like, okay, here's a bear, but now here's a narrow set of a polar bear. But it like going the other way, there's very little examples.
How do we know it was a change? And how do we know that it wasn't just there's this bear and there's a polar bear, and it's not a change from the beginning. Like it wasn't. So
I think it's like the matter of like, okay, they have analyzed the DNA sequences of the bears, like bears in general, and looked and compared them, and like it's almost the same in most of these areas, but this ATC got flipped, and now it's something else, and they're assuming that was some kind of change.
I see your question.
We don't know that.
It's like I created the ATC and I created the TCA,
Right.
and like they were not.
Right. This isn't.
We've had these conversations before. I'm like, but how did they know it wasn't two unique individuals? But they're just saying that they're so similar that it seems like an offshoot of one or the other.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there necessarily is. Is there a hard and fast rule? Like, no, we do know that these are from like one, and then it.
Well, I mean, we see it happen in dogs.
Sure.
Right. Like dogs are a good example, right? Like dogs and bears and dogs are kind of similar that way, or a lot of animals are kind of similar that way, where you get these like variations. And you look at like a wolf compared to a pug, and you're like, yeah, that's definitely degrading. Like you're not, it's not,
Sorry to do that.
How did that come from there?
Yeah.
Would that be so? Like when we read in Scripture, and God is talking about kinds, right? He's talking about in Genesis kinds in creation, and then with Noah, he says take one of every kind. Is that supportive of like bear kinds, where it's like I see what Nate is saying, because I've had those thoughts too. Like, how do we know it's not these two kinds of bears? Right.
Bear.
Like there was just bear or whatever the Latin name for bear is. And from that bear, we have all kinds, all types, offshoots. I don't know what the right word to say is. Bear. Is that this terminology that we see in Scripture with kind? I know we talked about this in earlier sessions, but
it definitely can be interpreted that way. Like,
like take this bird, and from this bird, as it continues to live, you will have all birds.
So classification of animals and species and genus and all that, like that's a structure invented by us. Right. Like we define what a species is, and we define, hey, that's a new species, that's not. Right. Like there is no objective standard.
Like in Scripture, when God's laying out the permissible birds, but then like he puts bats.
Yeah.
Like don't eat these flying creatures.
Yeah.
And the bat is lumped in with all these eatable birds.
Right.
Yeah.
Flying creatures. Yeah.
Yeah. Science, yes. In science, has a very sophisticated classification system. And I think we actually talk about that at some point in the future, in more detail. But yeah, there's ambiguity in how you define these things. In that book that I was mentioning with the bear, the Darwin De-Evolves book, he proposes that there's probably like kind is probably somewhere in the genus family area. So not species, but like a little bit higher up in like what we would in the tree of life, as you would say.
More of a generality.
Yeah, it's a little bit more generic than a species. Species is very that's like the lowest level one. So species to species evolution is like questionable, I'd say. But then as you go up, it's like, okay, that's clearly distinct. It's an interesting topic. We'll dive into that one more in future conversations, because it is fascinating how like that's just a construct that we made up, and it's a little bit. There are things that make it very difficult to classify certain things. Like it works well for the. Yeah, that's a great example.
What'd you say?
Like a platypus.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's a mammal that has eggs and a beak. Like where does that go?
It's got associated.
Right. Like take this one and categorize it. You can't.
The flood really puts a timeline on all of it, and it really it's either that or nothing, because that would establish how long it would take for all these species to evolve into different subspecies, and it's pretty hard to imagine that there would be a polar bear, a Kodiak, a black bear, all these different things on the ship at the same time. I mean, you'd think that ship would have to be 10 times the size if you're going to put all the subspecies in that too.
Right.
I mean, hey, you can sign up. They're going down, and you can check it out.
What?
Sailorville is gonna.
Oh, yeah.
This trip they
That's
go
right.
to the art.
Oh, the arc.
Yeah,
I didn't really look
got
at
this or
it.
something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't really want to check.
Thought about it. It was, but
I'm gonna go. We might actually go this summer.
There you go.
So
It's a good road trip.
you guys been doing?
No.
you guys were gonna go watch that
Yeah, last in April
a couple weeks ago.
when we went on the bourbon tour and all that
Oh,
stuff
yeah.
that we didn't do.
Yeah.
We're doing flooring instead.
Oh man,
Ah.
that sounds like a raw deal.
We
Way
still,
better.
it is. It is a raw deal.
Bourbon or flooring? Boo!
You may have heard the term, and maybe even I introduced this last week, but vestigial organs.
Mhm.
So that is basically a biological structure that once had a function but lost it as part of evolution. So a common example would be, well, I think the biggest known example is the appendix.
Mhm.
And that one's an interesting example because for a long time it was just a problem, like it just caused problems, right? Like people would all of a sudden have these severe pains and then they'd have to go and get their appendix taken out, and it's like, well, if I can live just fine without it, then
Why do I have it?
and so a lot of there's a lot of thought that it was vestigial. It was like leftover from a past. It served some function at some point, but now it's just useless, and we can just cut it out and just cause us problems. Well, now that science has progressed, we've learned that the appendix actually has a very important function. It stores a healthy, ideally, it stores a healthy microbiome of gut bacteria. So like when you'd have bouts of sickness and your guts get cleaned out of all that healthy microflora, it would be like a safe harbor for those
Like a
bacteria to then
I don't know.
replenish your supply.
Like a natural probiotic factory
It basically,
inside.
yep, that's exactly it.
It's interesting. I've never.
Yeah, and and then it's a very important function, especially, you think about a few hundred years ago, where like people were dying of dysentery and stuff. Like dysentery was a big problem,
Yeah.
and like that organ helped recover from those episodes. And but today, in modern times, we don't rely on our appendix as much because we can go to the grocery store and get a probiotic yogurt. Like that wasn't an option until very recently. So like we've almost made it less critical.
We've created a vestigial organ just by
Technology.
our own selves.
Yeah, kind of.
We don't need it.
But it's still super helpful. And even I was reading, I didn't dive into this topic too much, I should have, but for like medicine is finding ways to not have to remove the appendix during appendicitis. Like they're trying to find ways to not
From rupturing.
do that. And
Because of its
because
usefulness.
it has a use, and it's like, well, that's you can be okay without it, but it's better that you have it, and if we can treat it without removing it, that's better.
Interesting. Look into that.
And I saw some bits on that, but I didn't dive down that rabbit hole too far.
I'll do it for you.
All right.
Well, that's interesting why people almost die if it does burst because of all this stuff.
Yeah. Because
very
appendicitis is basically
Yeah.
with that biome that it's like holding on to goes bad.
Right. It's poison.
And it
You can go septic.
yeah.
It's like if your tummy pops.
It's like it's been corrupted. So it's supposed to hold the good stuff, but then it gets corrupted and now it's bad stuff, and it can cause a lot of problems.
It's interesting that they're like, it's, you can live without it, so it must not be necessary. People live with one lung all the time.
Yeah.
Or both our lungs are pretty important.
One kidney.
Yeah.
Or just like half a heart.
Your liver.
Yeah, there's so many,
Yeah.
like that, I mean, I understand we're going to go deeper and like there's more when people are with that argument, but that argument seems to fall apart so quickly as science continues to medical science continues to progress, because people are now functioning like the iron lung was created during, like, I would assume tuberculosis and things like that. There was one person, I think there's one person on the planet that still lives in an iron lung, like right now. They're the last person. They may be dead now.
I think I just saw on a headline that they
passed away.
But I could be wrong.
But they've been in there because of, I think, polio.
Yeah.
They ended up in there because of polio back in the 1930s? Anyway. And it's like, okay, well, if that's the case, if we can replace the lungs with a giant iron lung, then lungs aren't that great unless they crap out. Yeah. Same with your appendix. So that just seems so silly to make such a large statement when it's like things can be replaced with other things, or so that doesn't make them useless or pointless. It just means you didn't notice they were junk until they junked out. I don't know.
Anyway. The quality of life with an iron lung is not
it's awful. No, it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible.
So, I mentioned that larynx nerve. So there is actually a like a minority of people whose that nerve doesn't go around that artery; it goes direct, and they've found that it has caused conditions like. They're not really sure what's going on, but like some things aren't working correctly. So there might be a purpose that we haven't discovered yet on why it does that. Did I mention this with the eye? So the eye, I mentioned the eye being wired backwards. So one of when that was being researched, so the light sensitive cells in your eyes need a lot of blood flow. And when it's wired that way, it allows those cells to get better access to blood flow. And so if it wasn't wired that way, it could actually cause more problems. I say that, but then there's a counter argument to that where like,
well, that means the next thing downstream, that part was, designed poorly, or it's like, oh, if it has to be this way to get more blood, then that means this part's not correct. Well, and then if you have to change that to make it's like, then that means this part's not correct. And
like irreducible complexity, but backwards. Irreducible, chaotic, terrible design.
Like when you're talking about the different links of that nerve thing, to me, like when I hear that, the first thing I can do about it is like timing. Like it needs to be a bit longer because somewhere down the line there's a timing issue where if it was shorter, those signals would arrive at the next stage, which then processes them at these delayed times to
very well could be.
It's like a Rube Goldberg machine.
Yeah, so I work in the design field myself, and I design software, and there's often a myriad of design constraints that you have to consider. So if you go this route, well, then there's a trade-off, and now you start causing problems over here. And it's a fine balance on trying to find this optimal balance. And sometimes it's like, okay, this is the downside, but the other downside, if we did it the other way, is worse. And it's like this fine balance. And I think that's what we see a lot in life. But interestingly, cephalopods like squids and octopus, their eyes are not wired backwards like ours. They're wired what you would think would be the right way. Who knows why? I don't know.
We should ask.
Well, I mean, so if you ask an evolutionist,
they have 8 arms,
right? That's a lot to deal with.
yeah, that is a lot.
I need to be able to see what they're all doing all the time.
They are crazy creatures in themselves because like each of their arms has their own little brain. Yeah. So like they don't have a centralized brain per se. They kind of have like a network of brains, and like each brain controls
cephalopods are actually aliens, just so everybody knows. They don't belong.
It seems likely. And if you ask an evolutionary biologist about cephalopods, they would say that they evolved their eyes completely independently from like the rest of the tree of life. So like eyes have evolved multiple times in different ways is how they would say it.
So I'm just, as we're talking about this stuff and knowing our purpose and the Great Commission, like using words like counter argument kind of a thing. So it's like, so how do we always take this stuff? Because apologetics and stuff like that in and of themselves is not going to bring anybody to salvation. They need to hear the gospel. So you say counter argument, and it's like, okay, how can I take this conversation we're having and bring it back to the gospel and be like, okay, are you the type of person are you the type of person who's going to look at the salamander with the bum eyes and be like, wow, God is dumb? Or are you going to look at it and say like, wow, God is amazing? I'm going to dig into this more because I want to know more about God. Or are you digging into it more because, so having that conversation to then to talk about and exemplify our sin and all that. So just
right. I mean, it gets down to your presuppositions, right? Like the things you believe to be true, like your worldview. And if you have a worldview that is materialistic, then you're going to look for these things that help your argument. So we all have a cognitive bias towards finding information that supports our current view.
Yep.
And like that is true on both sides of the fence. And so like they're looking for evidence to support that there is no God. And they see these things that leaves them scratching their heads on like, why is it that way? That doesn't make sense. And they're like, well, of course it doesn't make sense. It wasn't intelligently designed. It just happened. Where, if you go the other direction, it's like, oh, wow, look how elegant this design is. It works so well.
Or look at like, this is a mysterious thing of something I'm not allowed to know because God is just greater than me. So this is more proof of God. Yeah. Like we'll bring in our own worldview to explain the thing in front of us to align with the worldview we already hold.
And I think the challenge for each individual person is to try to be open-minded but discerning. It's like, okay, I hear you. You talked about like, okay, if you're engaging with someone and you're talking about these things,
like gentle as a lamb but wise as a serpent.
Yeah, like as soon as you start arguing, you've lost. Yeah. Right?
The moment somebody in that conversation is angry, it's over.
Because that's just pride.
Yeah.
Even if it's me who's supposed to be bringing you to Christ, if I start getting like, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I'm getting angry, then I just...
And the assumption that like you, and not like you necessarily, Nate, but like the person sharing with who they are assuming is an unbeliever standing before them, to assume that we as the individual, so say I'm speaking to Jane Doe in front of me, I'm a Christian, I assume she's not, and we start having a conversation, I have to be careful to remember I don't know everything. I don't have God figured out 100%. I don't have scripture figured out 100%. I have, in my 36-year-old life experience, enough information to say, I believe he exists. And from my research, understanding, faith, growth, experience, I believe these things to be true. Thus, this is how I live my life. But to be careful not to say when she questions, like, what about a salamander with no eyeballs, to be like, be gone, Satan. Like, I don't know enough. Like, even if I subscribe to Christianity completely and entirely, I don't know it all completely. So for me to stand there and say my job in intelligent design discussions with unbelievers is to bring them to Christ maybe isn't my job in that moment. I don't know. But like, I think bringing everything back to a gospel place sometimes is a disservice in this field, because whether a salamander has eyeballs or not could be a tipping point for someone to reject God or accept, or it could simply be like, the salamander has no eyeballs. That's it. It just has no eyeballs.
It has eyeballs. They just don't work.
Sure. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So like, just being careful that like we don't assume we know everything, because that's what they're already doing for us, right? Like as a non-Christian, I have everything figured out and I can prove to you why your Christianity is stupid. If we turn around and say, because you don't have Christ, you're an idiot, let me prove that to you, we're doing exactly what they're doing. And in that moment, the argument is falling
it comes down
apart.
to humility.
Right.
And I often think to myself, what are the chances I actually know everything?
0%.
Right? Like, or like that I have the right opinion on all the things.
Yeah.
And
should you be expected to?
Yeah,
No.
no, it's like when you say it that
Solomon
way, it
did it.
seems.
I was thinking
everything.
everything
I
up.
like Solomon.
He was
Yeah.
given wisdom freely by the Lord and was like given a peaceful kingdom, and he allowed all of his pagan wives and people to ruin his life, and even then he was like, it's all for nothing.
Yeah.
Just like enjoy the life in front of you, enjoy the food in front of you, enjoy the little things, because tomorrow you're just vapor into the wind. Thank you, Kansas.
Yeah.
Anyway.
When it comes to requisite knowledge for gospel ministry stuff, regardless of what field it is you might be talking about, medicine, I always think about the Legion guy. He's wilding out.
Yeah.
Jesus shows up,
Yeah.
casts him out. They hang out for a couple hours. When he's like, "Hey, let me come with you," and Jesus says, "No, you are already perfectly equipped.
Yeah.
So I need you to stay here and share the gospel."
Yeah.
When really all that guy knows is, I was blind and now I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's sufficient.
Yeah.
Yep.
Totally. Yep.
Yeah, and like on a practical level, so there's a book I'd recommend. I've read it recently. It's called Tactics. If you're interested in like how to talk with people in these kinds of things.
Yep.
And its premise and like the whole like if anyone gets angry, it comes from that book.
Yeah.
Then you've lost. It's a great book on just how to maneuver those things in a respectful, biblical way.
Yeah.
And it's very much around asking questions, and that instead of confronting their things you disagree with.
Yeah.
So if they're arguing for the salamander that has non-functioning eyes, ask them questions about it, dig into it, like this, and like ask pointed questions about it, like and like you can kind of build the conversation that way, and then if they're open-minded person, they'll consider the questions you ask. And one of the things that I remember from his book is he says there are a lot of people. So you talked about the Great Commission. He's like we need more people, more gardeners,
and
not all harvesters.
Yes.
Right? He's like, we need more people planting seeds into people
and watering and nurturing.
Yep.
So that the harvesters can come along to those that are ready to be harvested and harvest.
Yeah, and he mentions he's like, my goal isn't to necessarily lead them to Christ. If that happens, great. But my goal is to leave a rock in their shoe, something that makes them think, and if it's just feels uncomfortable, that makes them just like, maybe I don't know everything. And
like that.
Yeah,
Who's the author?
I'll look it up right now.
That's huge.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah,
Look it up.
like that
That's
later
the
on.
beginning of the seed.
That's awesome.
Great.
yeah, it's a good. Dave Newell recommended it, and I was like, it was good. It was a good read.
So good.
Yeah. So
Great.
getting back to vestigial organs, we actually have other one. And it's not always an organ. Like another one is the coccyx, your tailbone, right? Leftover tail. And like sometimes someone gets born with
Babies are born with it.
Yeah.
They can't just chop it off because their
It's their
spinal cord is still in there.
I think it's more, if I remember right, it's more that it's exposed. It's like the bone is exposed.
Yes.
Not necessarily that it's like
outside of skin.
Nah, it's like wrapped in skin, but it's
Have you seen one before? Like a tail on a baby?
yeah.
Like it looks like a naked.
It's Seinfeld.
It's like it's like that, but sometimes they're a little bit longer. It looks like our dog.
Yeah.
Like his wiry little whippy tail, but it's just skin.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's hair on it too.
Yeah.
I follow those in the news whenever they're like, baby born in India with a tail. I'm like, I'm so interested. I want to see this kid.
Yeah.
But usually they're like, it's a manifestation of the monkey god. I'm like, oh, I think it's just a baby with a birth defect. You should help them.
Yes. Yeah. So, they're thinking, well, the coccyx doesn't really have a purpose. It's kind of left over from when we were One comes swinging from trees.
Sure.
Well, it actually does very much still serve a purpose. It's an anchor point for a lot of tendons and muscles.
Hurts.
Yeah, exactly. It's
fall on it. Yes.
yeah. It's not just a useless leftover. It still has a purpose. But we do we have any weird leftover things that might be like the salamander's functionalist eyes? In fact, I did find an example of that, and I thought it was pretty fascinating. You know how some people can wiggle their ears?
Oh.
You mean like the outside of it can move?
Like they can just
they just wiggle them without just magically
like they have a muscle they can just like wiggle their ears a little bit. It's pretty rare, but they've done some studies and it shows that it's actually linked to the hearing sections of the brain. So if you think of like a dog or a cat or a lot of animals really, when they hear something, they turn their ears towards it. And helps them like locate the sound. We as humans don't do that, but that like wiggling of the ears is tied into the auditory part of our brain, where it kind of like lights up when that muscle is activated. And it's like the fact that like some people just don't have that muscle, or it's just not strong enough to do anything or to have control over.
Sounds like a superpower.
Yeah, but the thing is it doesn't actually do anything. It just wiggles the ears. It doesn't actually move the ears in any meaningful way anymore. But it's just kind of this like little. It seems like a little leftover of something. How you make sense of that, you could talk about it a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
But it's kind of an interesting aspect that maybe it's an example of some microevolution aspect, or maybe it's.
So I think there's some people out there that are more prone to having I don't know. Like if that's the case, then would we see is there some? So what would that be? Like a subspecies? Like how do we even? If you got more people together, you said, okay, you have this full muscle and you have it, and then you breed those people.
Someone who can actually use their ears,
right? There, if we interbreed these people long enough and start moving our ears again, or how does that?
Maybe
conversation.
Well, this is kind of
can we create these dog-eared people?
Nate now has a new passion in life. He's gonna. He's
That's just what I want to hear about. Yeah.
How do I get those ears?
Yeah.
Whether or not okay, is this actually an evolved thing, or is it so that's where when I hear stuff I'm
skeptical. Yeah.
Well, how many other things that usually only animals can do? Do we have the 1 in a million people on Earth that have that? Right. Those other abilities, I guess. Yeah. What are there some other examples? I guess
one that just popped in my head would be you have we're mostly hairless, but you have people with those conditions that grow hair
Wolfman disease.
Yeah, Wolfman disease.
Or the guys. So I was a Ripley's Believe It or Not kid as oh man, the owl man. Did you ever see that guy? He could turn his head almost all the way around. He could just turn it almost all the way around. And it was just how his spine, his muscles, all of that. So he could do it and keep it there. It wasn't when we do this, we're we'll go here further. He could turn it and it would stay. It was wild.
Look straight backwards.
Almost. It wasn't 100% because otherwise he'd break his neck. His spinal cord would just... and then there's people that their skin is super duper stretchy, like flying squirrels. They can yank their skin out a super long ways, and that's.
So those are interesting because there a lot of them. So the skin one, that is a genetic disorder.
Yes.
And it's caused by a protein that gets changed.
Yep.
Right. So it's actually a mutation.
Yep.
Of sorts. It's a.
It's a bad thing.
Well, technically, yeah. Something's not working right.
Right.
But it gives this effect where your skin is super stretchy. And, that, if that was It doesn't get quite that,
Same.
you know.
I wish Adam and Eve would have held it together at least a little bit longer. And, like, could have read a little bit, and then maybe we could have seen some more stuff. But because it makes me wonder about, like, okay, so God creates everything and everything's good, right? And then Adam and Eve blow it, like we always have, and now everything is not. You know.
You mean what is the perfect human being before the pre-sin?
Well, and I even wonder though about, I wonder though about, like, if Adam and Eve were, like, what do we mean? How do we understand perfect?
Yep.
Were Adam and Eve necessarily perfect? I don't know that they were necessarily.
Did they have
They just
laser eyes?
didn't know. They didn't have the wisdom to know they weren't
And
perfect.
so,
Right.
And so that's what I wonder about, like, what things looked like it down, pre-sin, as far as, like, so everything's good, now everything is broken. What is goodness necessarily perfection? Maybe. That would be an interesting word
Philosophy.
Because, like, evil, we contribute evil. Like, part of the fall is, like, animals eating other animals.
Yeah.
But who's to say that's what that is?
Bad.
Right. Like, when Adam
and
Eve took that
it
bite,
was
or
all
whatever
meant
the
to be
actual,
perfect.
what the actual marker was
Yeah.
it the bite? Was it the decision? Yada yada. Whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
I just wonder if in that moment was there just a shudder that went throughout creation that was just like, like, if that's true about the, well, this nerve is now longer than then, it shouldn't be that way. Blah blah. It's like, did that
just changed every perspective, or did it actually?
Right. Did everyone add needles? Like, crap.
Yeah.
Right?
Because, like,
my nerve just
it just wound itself around. But, like, when we've had these discussions before, like, because, like, when you read it, at least for me, the way I grew up understanding it, because I don't know how everybody else sees it. I grew up understanding, like, that there was this like a shock wave that went out all the way through the universe. It was like, boom, and, like, now you're all corrupted by sin. But when I read scripture, it's man. Like, it didn't say that nature.
Well, it does say all of creation
All
groaned.
of creation fell.
Groaned. Doesn't say it fell. It groaned. It was, like, sad.
It felt
like the weight of it, right? Because he says, like, if we don't worship God, even, like, the rocks will cry out, right? So to me now, with, like, a little bit more maturity and maybe more open-mindedness, I don't know. When I read Genesis, I get a sense today, maybe tomorrow that will change, but today I get this sense that it was humanity. Like, humanity entered into sin, and sin was not necessarily that our bodies no longer functioned the way they were supposed to, but this disconnection between God and ourselves happened because he said, on this day you will die. They didn't die that day. Like, they didn't just, like, fall dead. But now the capacity to die, to be away from God, to be parted from him, entered in. And then with that, he also cursed them. Like, when a parent's like, don't eat that chocolate cake or I'll slap your hand. They did. And, like, okay, so now not only are you disappointed with them, but you also punish them by slapping their hand. So I don't know, like, to me, I don't see as much sin corruption in nature. Because to me, when I see, like, when my baby chick died, I was devastated. Yeah, one of my baby chicks died, guys. Oh, it was devastating. She just failed to thrive. Anyway, I looked at that and I was like, part of my mind was like, it's just part of the fall. But I'm like, is it? Like, animals, when they die, we eat them. And that is a blessing to us. When they die, they become part of the earth, which allows the plants that nourish our bodies to thrive and to grow. So to me, I only subscribe death because death to me is scary. Mm-hmm. Death to me is the end of my consciousness, whatever, my relationship with people, all of that. It's very sad. But when an animal dies, it brings goodness. It brings food and nourishment so we can continue to live. And it brings food and nourishment to the ground so that we can continue to live. So it's like, is evil and sin in nature a thing, or is it more in mankind? And because of our sin, we continue to corrupt nature because we're jacked up. And nature in itself glorifies God as it always has, but we interact with it in a way that breaks it down and corrupts it. Just a thought. Not saying any of that is true.
Well, I mean, that's a whole nother topic.
I know, that's our philosophy conversations.
Yeah. That was just open the door.
Sorry.
It isn't easy to close.
Sure it is. Just go, thanks, honey. Now we're moving on to something else.
Yeah.
Back to the tails.
Yeah.
Back to the tails.
Tails are awesome. No, I know. Sorry.
I do think you got me thinking.
I'm sorry.
obviously,
I'm
but,
so
like,
sorry. That's what I do.
There's a
I'm so
couple of
sorry.
thoughts that came to mind when you were saying that. One was like people still had long lives after the fall, right?
Yeah.
Death was a thing, but like
It wasn't after the flood.
it wasn't after
Yeah,
the
that it
flood.
was like 120 years.
So
yeah.
well, there's something going on there. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think we really know what. There's theories, but it seems like our bodies once functioned better, even post fall, and then it's like they degraded, almost like de-evolution,
Right.
Or something like that. Like corruption came in and like it kind of caught up with us, and like honestly, it was God saying that, hey, you're only living 100 years to help you not be corrupt.
Forever. Can you
Because
imagine if Hitler lived for 350 years?
the longer we
Bad
lived,
day.
it seemed like length of life and corruption were somehow correlated.
Right. Evil has to have an end in humanity.
Yeah.
Death.
But the other thing that came to mind was like God did say that like He's going to recreate heaven and earth. Hence, there's something worth recreating. I don't know what that means, but it makes me think that there's something more than just humanity, because the heavens and earth will be renewed.
Because of the corruption of all things, like they use this going to like heaven and earth are going to pass away. Where if they weren't tainted by like, then they would probably continue in their eternality. But because of their corruption, like
We've touched it though. Like we've touched it.
Yeah, maybe we caused
We've
the
touched
problem.
all of eternity. Like when we spew our garbage out into space, literally, not like karma, but there's so much junk that surrounds our entire Earth all the time, like materialistic junk. That like if an asteroid comes in and like flicks it and it's off course, now it could be like halfway to Jupiter and a half now. But like we've touched all of the universe, like we've touched all of creation in our brokenness. I don't know. I don't disagree with you, Nate.
No,
it's just another
it's an
concept that I'm
interesting
like, no, nature is perfect. We're busted.
So I
But
do want
could
to
be
get
100%
to
wrong.
one of the big, I mean, it's like the longest part of this whole chapter, but we've talked about it a little bit before, and it's junk DNA. So when the genome got sequenced and they started looking at it, only 1% to 2% of DNA encodes proteins. So if you remember that, like DNA's function is to encode these proteins that then get synthesized in this production and make all the proteins we need. So only 1% to 2% of our DNA is actually encoding these, like this chunk of DNA makes this protein. So the theory, like evolutionists were like, yeah, that totally makes sense because all of life has evolved and changed and like things have gotten put in and taken out and mutated, and there's going to be a lot of junk in there. So like it was like, yep, we predicted it, this is how it's going to be. And that was a big thing. Like junk DNA was a real mystery, but no one was really investigating it because, I mean, scientifically, because why would you? That's what we would expect to see, right? If we evolved, we'd have a bunch of junk DNA. Totally makes sense.
What scientist wants to say, I'm researching junk?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think you get funding for that.
Well, and there was a lot of peer pressure to be like, well, why would you even do that? It obviously isn't doing anything. It's not encoded in a protein, and that's the job of DNA, to encode these proteins.
Yeah.
And like there's junk DNA, and then there's like this other term called pseudogenes, which are like supposedly broken, useless copies of once functional genes. So there's a little distinction there. Junk DNA is like, hey, this never really did anything that we know of. It's just kind of like random letters that don't have any function. And then pseudogenes is like, hey, this once had a word in it, but now it's unreadable. So what happens here? there was, this time that this was kind of this thing, like, so interesting enough. So he's an interesting character. Francis Collins, he had a quote, 45% of the human genome is made up of such genetic flotsam and jetsam,
That's nonsense.
You have nonsense. And Francis Collins is actually pretty interesting. He claims to be a Christian. He was the head of the NIH, National
Institute of Health.
Yeah. So he was like NHI, yeah. Like he was a big, like he came on and talked about like when COVID was going on and stuff like that. But he was also one of the founding leading members of the Human Genome Project. He also claims to be a Christian. But he's a theistic evolution Christian, so he believes we evolved still. But he claims to be a Christian. He wrote a book called The Language of Life. I think that's the title of it, something along those lines, where he talks about how like crazy DNA is and how it's kind of like a language and all of that. It's an interesting read for sure. And he has some really interesting points, but he definitely still holds to evolution, even though he's a Christian. So kind of a unique perspective, and he's been very contributed a lot to science, especially with the Human Genome Project. However, okay, so this all comes out, most of the DNA is junk. Intelligent design proponents have pointed out that, we think this junk DNA actually does something. Don't know what, but, based off of intelligent design, we're saying that it seems weird that it wouldn't do anything. So
wait and see method.
Yeah. Yep. And they turn out to be correct. As science has progressed, there was a groundbreaking study called ENCODE, and it was in 2012, so fairly recently, and it was published in Nature magazine. It involved hundreds of scientists. The conclusion was the vast majority, 80.4% of the human genome participates in at least one biochemical function. That's a lot higher than 1 to 2%. Since ENCODE only analyzed a minority of human cell types, it leads scientists predicting it's likely that 80% will go up to 100% because there was a narrow, like the scope wasn't full.
Right.
So ENCODE basically said that all of the DNA has function.
Right.
So there is no junk DNA.
Shocker.
Yeah. Which is a huge blow. And like not even like it was a big deal in the evolutionary thing because the evolutionists were like, hey, this totally makes sense. Junk DNA.
Yeah. It explains their theory.
Yeah,
really
this totally fits our hypothesis.
Yeah.
And then it was like, nope, it's all functional. And they were left like,
well, crap.
well, yeah.
What about the appendix?
Yeah, but what about the salamanders that have eyeballs that don't work?
God's dumb.
You're all dumb, and I'm not playing anymore.
It was
Wizard of Oz.
going home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is dumb. You guys are mean.
Yeah, and it hit mainstream media like
Yeah. It's tough.
Yeah.
It's like the Big Bang where it was like, oh crap, that means that there was a not and then there was a start. We're just gonna ignore it. Don't worry about it.
Yep. Yeah. They were like, we have to go back and rewrite like textbooks and stuff because of how
really expensive.
Yeah.
And like, can you imagine your whole career, like 30, 40 years of like resting on the shoulders as an evolutionary biologist, a professor, like you went into college teaching people that junk DNA is legit, it's for reals, and then like your whole life all of a sudden is useless, pointless, wrong,
And
completely.
teaching all these years.
Yes,
something
like you would
not true.
you would feel like your whole life just was erased for no purpose.
But they did all the work, they did all the research. It'd be like, and I don't know if Edison, well, I don't know if they've ever heard of like Edison being a Christian or whatever.
Edison was a really bad guy.
So
Thomas Edison.
But he talks about like, I didn't fail. I found 752 ways.
10,000.
Not reliable. So
Yeah.
what if these scientists were like, oh crap, like this particular thing wasn't right, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Because we learned this stuff and now we'll move on to the next one.
Yeah.
But instead they're like, they take it like this huge blow to their
Yeah.
pride. And it's like, they're like, hey, careful what we think. We're going to check it out.
Yeah.
Oh, that wasn't it.
Right.
Okay, no problem. Let's pivot.
Right.
And that's what
Right.
scientists is supposed to be.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you talk about what science should be, that's it. It's like, hey, let's find the truth.
Yeah.
of
And then
how this
pivot
is.
when we're wrong.
Right.
And there's
you're wrong.
Fun.
And
Yeah.
then
Yep.
It takes a long time for that to trickle its way down to the elementary and junior high textbooks.
Oh, yeah.
Years and years and years.
Years.
before
there's a lot of stuff
that.
in
Yeah,
this.
so all those years, these kids are all being taught something that is clearly wrong.
Like the baby
And
that
then,
evolves
like,
from like the lizard to the human baby, like that was proven wrong in like the 1970s, 1960s, and it's still in there.
Like the diagrams.
They know it's wrong. They're like, just disregard, but teach it. It's completely wrong. But yeah, it's so bad.
It really is.
Even if
I actually think
purely
there's another-
purely outside of religion, it's like, don't teach. Like 1 and 1 is not 5. Stop it. Like you know that's wrong. Yes, that is incorrect. Like that is faked. That has been faked for decades and decades, and we've known it, and it still shows up in our textbooks today.
Haeckel's
It's
embryo.
ridiculous.
Gee, I don't know. That's not Haeckel. Haeckel's embryo drawings. Yeah.
Yeah, it's ugh. And like
I'm
Lucy,
saying that name
I think, isn't that right? Lucy, like the thing that was like, look at this skull, this
Oh, yeah.
proves, and they were like, no, they took 4 different bones and glued them together, and then they presented it as
Really?
Lucy. That has been a myth, a hack. That was a charlatan, and it got proved so fast, and yet we're still like, look, Lucy exists. It's like, no, that's not a thing.
Well, if you think about it, you think about the motivations of a scientist, like, and we've talked about this before, like they're motivated to find like the missing link, find these
They're already at
things.
the end, and they're just filling in
Yes.
everything
Yeah.
How do we get there?
according to what suits their end
Yes.
result.
Yes.
And everything else they're not going to actually look at or
Right.
present.
Yeah, they have a
Exactly.
dogma. They have a dogma, and they're trying to stick with it. And so there's some irony in all of this junk DNA stuff, right? Because a big criticism of intelligent design is like, okay, if you believe in a creator, that means like, why would we even do science, right?
Right.
Like, okay, God of the gaps,
Yeah.
like, why do science? Because there's a God. You just say everything God did it, and like,
Don't ask questions.
you don't need to investigate any further.
Mhm.
Well, that's exactly what happened opposite here, right? They were all like, junk DNA is useless, don't even bother studying it, like focus on something that's actually, does something.
Mhm.
It hindered science because of their presuppositions. And, it's interesting that, I'm not saying that people on the opposite side, so like the church, Christians, intelligence, like there are some of that on both sides.
Yep.
And I think it takes like, okay, it takes that open-minded discernment to work through that and be humble to be like, hey, I'm willing to, hear that out. I'm willing to think about it and avoid our cognitive biases to just find information that supports our only view.
Yeah.
But instead be like, hey, how can I challenge, if I challenge my beliefs and they hold up, how much stronger are they?
Yeah.
But if I never challenge my beliefs, they're just standing on sticks.
Yep.
It's like any wind
House
could,
built on sand.
like it could just blow over so easily if I hear one thing that doesn't line up to what I think. But if you challenge that, you build up hey, you can build confidence in what you believe.
They say out there.
Yeah, it 100% does.
And it makes it your own.
Yep.
Like that's something that I've appreciated with your passion for this, and like us just having more conversations of where you've challenged my faith, because my faith was built on people just telling me what was true, because that was simple, and I put authority on those people. And then I would hear something and there would be this internal panic of like, I heard this and I can't reconcile it on my own. Then what? Oh no, blah, blah, blah. The actual panics, like straight panic attacks. And as we've grown in our faith, you've grown in yours, I've grown in mine, and we've built this concept, at least in our home, of like what you do, Nate, which is like, I refuse to accept what you've simply said because you've said it's true. And taking it and going, I'm going to do the legwork. And then once I've come to a conclusion, I now own that conclusion. I've done the work. And when I've done that with my faith and taken that into like intelligent design and things like that, there's been some stuff that I have learned to be comfortably uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
Like my Bible does not answer that, and neither does science. And originally I would be like, I'm just going to do the God of the gaps and be like, I don't know, Jesus probably just like made it that way. I don't know. Instead be like, I don't know, let's see what happens. Maybe science can say it just is, like, or it evolved or whatever. But over time
Or I don't care.
Or I don't care. But there are some.
This thing I read, it's like I don't care, dude. I'm
Yeah.
not gonna do it.
Yeah. But like I have found that, yeah, when you allow for challenge and when you allow for comfortable debate, and when one person is willing to be like, I've never considered that, or I disagree with it, but I don't know why I disagree with it. So I'm going to go do the legwork and come back and say, I still disagree with you, but here's why. Like, you own that, and it builds a confidence in you to be like, I'm just not taking somebody's word because they are this person. I'm going to like do the legwork, but that's not for everybody. But man, when you do it, yeah, it's like if tomorrow, like, somebody came out and said, we literally started life in a lab with 0 things and we created life in the lab, that would not shake my faith at all. Because it would, this concept of like this wait and see situation brings comfort to me. Like, just because we can do things here on planet Earth, figure it out, boil it down to its essence, at what point does that take away that a God exists?
Yeah.
It just doesn't. Like, if he can be explained away through simple lab experiments, he must not really be a God worth worshiping, in my opinion. He has to be bigger than that.
Yeah.
He's not challenged.
Because, like, you know, and you learn to think through those things in a better way, right? So, like, okay, if someone just made life in a lab, like, let's say they even just like made a new animal,
right?
You know, just like straight up new animal,
right?
Practically an impossible task, but if they did it, you know, I'd be like, well, yeah, they had an intelligent person design that creature.
Yeah, it'd be hard to.
I mean,
atheist my way into that.
Yeah, you know, and like, so you can kind of like work through like, okay, how does that affect my faith? How does that affect my worldview? And you know, it's all about that, like, not being afraid to challenge what you hold true and like work through it, even though it's uncomfortable.
Yep.
Because when you come out from the other side, it's your faith is that much firmer.
Yep.
And it's like, you know, like the whole topic of like, so you mentioned the Lucy skull, but like all of these other types, Neanderthals, and like that's a tricky topic, right?
The little hobbit skull that they found
in
the Netherlands,
like the hobbits,
like the Lord of the Rings is real, guys. Hobbits exist.
When you walk through a museum and you see all the things that are presented as fact, you know, the billion-year-old creatures to the evolution of man through the Neanderthal period, and all those things are presented as fact. You know, it can be very confusing.
Yeah,
it can't just automatically assume that is the way that it is because science says so. Even science among themselves has arguments on that.
They get it wrong.
Type of stuff.
Yes,
they do, and it's they're not simple topics. It's you know, I think that's why it's so rare today's society, as we live in a social media meme world where it's like everything has to fit in this like tweet size statement, and like none of this stuff is
tweetable.
It takes effort to dig into. You can't just quickly get these headlines, and you have to investigate the facts that are presented because a lot of times they have a bias behind them and they have a presupposition behind them. Like almost every museum in America has a materialistic presupposition behind it. And like, okay, that's fine.
And they gotta sell tickets.
And they got
Right.
but then you can start interpreting it,
Which
and then you can
becomes
start thinking
political.
about it.
And they have to make certain people happy.
Yeah.
And people have to agree that this is okay. And
Mhm.
Yeah, there's so much that goes into it.
But if you know that ahead of time and walk in, you can appreciate the beauty of what you're seeing, like the anatomy or like all the different kinds of skulls, or what are these creatures, or is there change in humanity, and just stand back and appreciate it without necessarily subscribing to
right.
the authoritative individual who is like, this is what this says. You're like, okay, cool, maybe. But if I want to know, then it's my job for myself to do the research to figure it out. Yeah.
Because, it goes both ways too.
Yeah.
Like you guys brought up the ark. That has a clear
Yeah,
agenda and bias as well.
100%.
It has a creationist
Mindset. Worldview.
presupposition.
Yeah.
And, you have to walk into that, and like, if you're going to be fair, like, have that same kind of like, okay, maybe some of this is really helpful, and some of it maybe they've gone the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm.
Because so that's Ken Ham stuff, and he has some, it's probably not something we can talk about more, but like, he presumes creation,
Young Earth.
young Earth, and all those things, and like, I'm not saying you can't have that view, but like, there's other ways of looking at it. And he's just looking at it from this one way. So like, you just gotta be mindful on like, okay, who's putting this thing on, who made this video, what's their presupposition, what's their worldview. Ask questions and just think through it. If something doesn't sit right, investigate it. And that's literally what discernment is, in my mind. It's like, okay, that doesn't sit right with me. I want to investigate. I want to look into it.
Well, and look at the evidence.
Yeah.
Look at the evidence and actually consider it.
Yeah.
Don't just overlook it because you automatically are looking this way, but
Right.
actually consider it. And is it reasonable?
Yeah.
Yep. And from our, who we hold as Christians that there's two sources of truth: Bible and nature. God made both. God breathed the scripture into man's minds, and he made everything. So we should be looking to those sources of truth for our evidences and interpreting them accordingly.
Yeah.
But like that's not easy to do. Like,
It's not something you do on like a random Saturday
yeah.
and have it all figured out.
It's not. I mean, I think that's where a lot of people make mistakes.
This is what we're gonna have.
You're gonna have to leave, Nate. You're gonna need your money back, guaranteed. Yeah, great
By the
question.
end of this, we would have all the answers.
Oh yeah.
You just came for donuts and conversation.
This is you'll have more questions than answers, sort of thing.
That's the best part.
Opens your mind.
Woo.
All right. Cool. So we'll close up there. I'll pray for us, and
What's next time?
next time we're going to talk about common descent. So we're talking.
Tree huggers?
Actually, no, it's.
That's what it says. Tree huggers.
Oh, so next time we are talking about the tree of life,
Yeah.
And how like classifications work, and the various, like how they classify things. So a lot of it is like morphology based. Like it started as like, hey, that thing looks like that other thing, so we must just share an ancestor. But things have gotten more modern, where it's more like DNA comparisons. So like that's caused some like common